The dust of the high desert settled on the immaculate tarmac of Blackwood Range as the transport bus hissed to a stop. From its belly spilled a fresh batch of young, ambitious airmen, their faces a mixture of bravado and apprehension. They were the future of aerial warfare, the chosen few selected to pilot the nation's most advanced unmanned combat systems. They moved with the crisp energy of youth, their chatter filling the otherwise silent morning. Last off the bus was a woman who did not share their energy. She moved with a deliberate economy of motion, her presence as quiet as the heat shimmering off the asphalt. Master Sergeant Alara Vance was her name, according to the manifest, a rank that denoted experience, but, on her, seemed strangely out of place. She wasn't old, perhaps late 30s, but a profound stillness clung to her, a stark contrast to the restless cadets who now eyed her with casual curiosity. They saw the rank on her collar and the unassuming set of her shoulders and categorized her instantly. Ground crew, logistics, a career non-commissioned officer assigned to a backwater training facility to quietly finish her years. She was background scenery, part of the machinery that would support their ascent. Alara felt their glances but did not meet them. Her gaze was fixed on the distant hangars, steel structures that shimmered like mirages under the relentless Nevada sun. She carried a single, worn duffel bag, its weight familiar in her hand. Inside were the necessities of a transient life, items pared down to their most essential forms. There were no photographs, no mementos, nothing that spoke of a life outside the rigid confines of service. She had learned long ago that possessions were anchors, and she had been adrift for a very long time. The wind picked up, whipping fine grains of sand against her fatigues. She didn't flinch. She simply stood, a fixed point in the swirling dust and burgeoning ambition, waiting for the indifferent administrative process to swallow her whole. The base was a monument to cutting-edge technology, a place where pixels and algorithms decided life and death thousands of miles away. But the bureaucracy was as ancient and unyielding as the surrounding mountains. She was a name on a list, a warm body to be filed away. The cadets were already being greeted by a stern-faced instructor, their futures laid out in welcoming speeches and stern warnings. No one came for Alara. She was not part of their story. She was simply a sergeant, and sergeants found their own way. She shifted the duffel bag to her other shoulder and began the slow walk toward the administrative building, her boots making soft, rhythmic sounds on the pavement, a quiet counterpoint to the boisterous energy of the men she had arrived with. They saw a functionary, a cog. They could not see the ghost walking among them. Colonel Madsen looked at the file on his desk, and then at the woman standing before him. The file was a study in deliberate emptiness. Master Sergeant Alara Vance. 20 years of service. A string of assignments in maintenance, supply chain management, and simulator diagnostics. There were commendations, of course, perfunctory medals for good conduct and meritorious service, the kind of awards that filled a shadow box but told no story. It was the file of a perfectly average, unremarkable career soldier. But the woman herself didn't feel average. She stood at a parade rest that was too perfect, too still. Her eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, held a depth that made him uneasy. They weren't defiant or subservient. They were simply observant, taking in everything in his office without judgment. "Sergeant," Madsen began, his voice laced with the weary authority of a man who had seen thousands of faces like hers pass through his command. "Your file is sparse. It says you're here to assist with simulator upkeep. This is a high-tempo facility. We are training the next generation of combat drone pilots on systems that are more advanced than some of our active-duty aircraft. It's not a retirement post." He leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "What, exactly, do you expect to contribute here?" Alara's posture didn't change. Her gaze remained steady. "Whatever is needed, sir." Her voice was low, devoid of inflection. It was not the answer he wanted. He wanted to hear about specific certifications, about experience with the new Wraith drone simulators, about an eagerness to mentor the young airmen. Her answer was a blank wall. It felt like a dismissal of his entire world. He saw it as apathy, the quiet resignation of someone who had given up on ambition. He sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. Right? Well, Sergeant, we have a wing of older T3 simulators in Hangar 4. They're relics, mostly used for basic flight dynamics before the cadets move on to the real systems. The maintenance crews are swamped with the new tech. You can make yourself useful there. Keep them calibrated. Keep them clean. Lieutenant Carver will be your nominal supervisor, but frankly, he has more important things to worry about. Stay out of the way of the primary training operations. It was a clear dismissal, an assignment to the technological boneyard. Hangar 4 was where old equipment went to die, and he had just sent her there to be its caretaker. It was a glorified janitorial role. "Understood, sir," she said, the words as clean and empty as before. There was no flicker of disappointment, no hint of resentment. Her emotional neutrality was more unnerving than any protest would have been. She rendered a crisp salute, turned with a precision that felt out of place for a maintenance specialist, and walked out of his office. Madsen watched her go, a frown creasing his brow. He was a man who understood systems, hierarchies, and the clear, legible language of ambition. Alara Vance was an anomaly, a piece that didn't fit the puzzle. He picked up her file again, flipping through the thin pages as if they might reveal something he had missed. But there was nothing, just a ghost, a name, and 20 years of shadows. He tossed the file into his out tray, deciding she wasn't worth any more of his time. She was just another sergeant, after all, a problem for Hangar 4. Hangar 4 was a cavern of concrete and stillness, smelling of ozone and old dust. It housed the ghosts of aviation's recent past. 6T, 3 simulator pods sat in 2 neat rows, their shells scuffed and their screens dark. The new pilots, like the cocksure Lieutenant Carver, sneered at them as relics, dinosaurs from an age before haptic feedback and neural-linked interfaces. To them, these machines were toys. To Alara, they were honest. She spent her days in the quiet hum of the hangar, moving with a methodical grace. She didn't just clean the simulators. She communed with them. She ran diagnostic scripts that went far deeper than the standard maintenance checks, her fingers flying across the command line interfaces with a speed that belied her logistics background. She recalibrated gyroscopic sensors with a jeweler's touch and resoldered frayed connections on motherboards with the steady hand of a surgeon. A young airman, a tech specialist named Diaz, was the only one who ever ventured into Hangar 4, usually to cannibalize part from the old machines for the newer, more temperamental models in the main training bay. He watched her work from a distance, intrigued by her silence. She never spoke unless spoken to, yet she seemed to be in constant conversation with the machines around her. One afternoon, Diaz approached as Alara was leaning deep inside the chassis of Unit 7, the oldest and most neglected simulator in the bay. Her sleeve had ridden up her forearm, and for the first time he saw the tattoo. It was on the inside of her wrist, a delicate, almost skeletal design inked in faded black. It looked like a single, stylized wing, but it was fractured, made of sharp, geometric lines, and entwined with a wisp of something that resembled smoke or a ghost. It wasn't the typical bravado ink of a soldier. No skulls, no flags, no eagles. It was subtle, almost secret. "Cool tattoo, Sergeant," Diaz said, trying to break the silence. Alara pulled back from the machine, her sleeve falling back into place. She glanced at her wrist, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes, and then looked at him. "It's old," she said, and nothing more. She turned her attention back to Unit 7. She ran a hand over its console, her touch lingering on the worn joystick and the throttle quadrant. The other pilots avoided this machine, complaining its controls were sluggish and its processor too slow. But Alara seemed to prefer it. She would often sit in its cockpit for long stretches, the screen dark, her eyes closed, as if listening to something no one else could hear. She was learning its quirks, its history, its soul. The hangar was her sanctuary, a place where she could shed the weight of observation. Here, among the forgotten machines, she wasn't Master Sergeant Vance, the quiet maintenance woman. She was someone else entirely. She was a keeper of secrets, both her own and those embedded in the silicon and wire of the machines she so carefully tended. Diaz left her to her work, the image of the strange tattoo lingering in his mind. It felt like a symbol, a key to a language he didn't understand. He had the distinct feeling that the woman he knew as a quiet sergeant and the silent machines she cared for shared a history far deeper than anyone on the base could possibly imagine. The pressure began to build subtly, like a change in barometric pressure before a storm. The exercise was called Operation Red Sand, the capstone project for the current class of drone pilots. It was a grueling, hyper-realistic simulation designed to test their ability to defend a high-value asset, a simulated forward operating base from a new generation of enemy AI. This AI didn't operate on predictable scripts. It learned. It coordinated swarm drone attacks with an emergent intelligence that was terrifyingly adaptive. The entire exercise was run on the new, top-of-the-line Wraith simulators, billion-dollar machines that were the pride of Blackwood Range. And they were failing. The processing load was too much. The advanced swarm logic, coupled with the high-fidelity graphics and environmental physics, was causing the systems to lag, stutter, and then crash. One by one, the top cadets were being humbled. Lieutenant Carver, the golden boy of the class, was on his 5th attempt. His face, usually a mask of easy confidence, was now slick with sweat. He cursed under his breath as his drone controls became unresponsive for a critical half-second. On the main screen in the command center, his virtual aircraft spiraled out of control, torn apart by a dozen smaller, faster enemy drones. System crash. God damn it. Carver slammed his fist on the console. It's impossible. The lag is a death sentence. Colonel Madsen stood behind a row of frantic technicians, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. This exercise wasn't just a final exam. It was a proof-of-concept demonstration for a panel of Pentagon budget analysts due to arrive in 3 days. Failure was not an option. Get the engineers from Kronos Dynamics on the line now, he barked at a subordinate. Tell them their billion-dollar toys are about to cost them their contract. The atmosphere in the command center was thick with panic and the smell of burnt coffee. Voices were sharp, movements jerky. The calm, controlled environment of the high-tech facility had fractured, revealing the raw human anxiety beneath. Through it all, Alara remained in the shadows of Hangar 4, observing the chaos from a single monitor she had linked to the main command feed. She watched the replays, her expression unreadable. She saw the pilots react to the swarm's attacks, always a step behind. They were fighting the enemy they could see. They weren't fighting the code itself. She saw their frustration, their reliance on the technology to do the work for them. They were skilled operators, but they were not true pilots. They didn't feel the machine. They only commanded it. She turned from the monitor and looked at Unit 7, its dark screen reflecting her stoic face. The old machine sat silent and waiting. It lacked the processing power of the Wraith simulators, but its architecture was simpler, more direct. It was honest iron. While the others flailed against the limits of their complex technology, Alara was running quiet calculations of her own, a plan forming in the silent spaces of her mind. The storm was breaking, and the base was not ready. But she was. The command center was a tomb of silent frustration. The call with the engineers from Kronos Dynamics had been a disaster of corporate buck-passing and technical jargon that solved nothing. Madsen's face was a thundercloud. He was watching his career circle the drain as Lieutenant Carver geared up for yet another failed attempt. The air was so thick with tension it felt hard to breathe. It was at that moment a figure emerged from the darkened doorway that led to Hangar 4. It was Master Sergeant Vance. She walked into the bright, frantic light of the command center without a sound, her presence immediately drawing the eyes of the technicians and junior officers. They looked at her with a mixture of confusion and annoyance. What was the maintenance lady doing here? Sir, Alara said, her voice cutting cleanly through the nervous chatter. She addressed Madsen directly, ignoring everyone else. Unit 7 is stable. Carver let out a short, derisive laugh. What? That museum piece? He scoffed, not even bothering to look at her. Sergeant, its processor couldn't render a single one of these enemy drones. let alone the entire swarm. "We're a little busy here." Madsen was about to wave her away, to dismiss her as he had done from the start, but something in her unwavering gaze stopped him. There was no suggestion in her tone, no hint of doubt. It was a simple statement of fact. "What are you saying, Sergeant?" he asked, his voice low. Alara walked past the gleaming, failed Wraith simulators and sat down in the dusty, vacant chair in front of the auxiliary console, the one patched into the old T3 systems. "I can run the scenario," she said. She didn't wait for permission. Her hands moved over the keyboard, her fingers a blur of motion. Code scrolled across the monitor at an impossible speed. She wasn't just launching the simulation. She was fundamentally altering it. On the fly, she stripped out the non-essential processes, the high-resolution textures, the volumetric cloud effects, the particle physics that made the explosions look so pretty. She was gutting the simulation's aesthetic shell, rerouting every spare cycle of the old processor's power directly to the tactical and physics engines. "What is she doing?" someone whispered. The main screen flickered, and the red sand scenario loaded. The graphics were crude, almost abstract. The world with a wireframe grid, the drone's simple geometric shapes. It looked like a video game from a bygone era. Carver sneered openly. But then she began to fly. Her hands danced between the stick, the throttle, and the keyboard. She wasn't just piloting the drone. She was manipulating the digital environment itself. She used the stripped-down physics engine to her advantage, executing maneuvers that were theoretically impossible, using server latency as a weapon, anticipating the AI's moves not just by watching the screen, but by feeling the flow of data through the ancient machine. The swarm descended, and she met it not with brute force, but with a terrifying, elegant precision. She moved like a phantom, a ghost in the machine, her simple wireframe drone weaving through the complex enemy formations, picking them apart one by one. The room fell utterly, completely silent. All eyes were glued to the screen, watching a master at work. She didn't just defeat the swarm, she dismantled it. The final enemy drone vanished in a silent blip of light, and the words "Mission Complete" appeared on the screen in stark, blocky letters. Alara's hands dropped from the controls. She leaned back in the chair, the slightest tremor in her fingers the only sign of the immense effort. She had not broken a sweat. The silence in the command center was no longer one of frustration. It was one of absolute, stunned awe. The recording of the simulation played on the main screen in a continuous loop. No one had ordered it. The system had just defaulted to replaying the last successful run. The room was still silent, but the quality of the silence had changed again. It was now analytical, disbelieving. The pilots, including a deeply humbled Lieutenant Carver, stood watching it, their faces etched with a dawning comprehension. They were seeing things in the playback they had missed in the moment. The subtle feints, the predictive positioning, the way she had forced the swarm AI into recursive logic traps that caused its complex formations to break down. She hadn't just outflown the enemy. She had outthought it on a level they couldn't grasp. "Ow!" Carver finally breathed the word, his voice barely a whisper. He was looking at Alara, who was quietly running a cool-down diagnostic on the T3 console, her attention fully on the machine. "How did you do that?" Alara finished her sequence and powered down the simulator. The main screen went dark, plunging the room into a heavier quiet. She finally turned to look at him, her pale blue eyes holding his for a long moment. "The machine told me what it needed," she said simply. The answer was so profound and yet so utterly baffling that it left him speechless. He had been trying to force the technology to obey him. She had listened to it. Colonel Madsen pushed himself off the wall he had been leaning against. He walked slowly toward Alara, his boots echoing in the cavernous room. He stopped in front of her, truly seeing her for the first time. The quiet maintenance sergeant was gone. In her place was a weapon of unknown caliber. "Vance," he said, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. "What is your real story?" Before she could answer, the young airman, Diaz, spoke up from the back of the room. His voice was hesitant, full of reverence. "Sir, that tattoo on her wrist." All eyes turned to Alara. She instinctively pulled her sleeve down, a gesture of concealment that was too late. "I've seen it before," Diaz continued, his voice gaining confidence. "Not in person. In my grandfather's old study. He was one of the original engineers for a program back in the early days of unmanned flight. It was black budget, totally classified. They called it the Ghost Program." A ripple of shock went through the assembled personnel. The Ghost Program was a legend, a myth whispered about in intelligence circles. It was said to have used a single, anonymous pilot to test the most dangerous and experimental drone technologies, flying missions that were officially denied and would never be declassified. The pilot was a prodigy, someone who could merge with the systems, whose call sign was a whisper in the dark. Madsen stared at Alara, his mind racing, recontextualizing everything. The sparse file, the quiet confidence, the impossible skill. "The insignia," Diaz said, his eyes wide. It was the unit patch for the pilot. Just one pilot. A single, skeletal wing. They called her Phantom. The next 48 hours passed in a state of suspended reality for the personnel of Blackwood Range. Operation Red Sand was completed, with Alara quietly running the remaining cadets through the simulation on the stable, if archaic, Unit 7. She didn't coach or instruct in the traditional sense. She simply created the conditions for them to learn, subtly adjusting parameters to challenge their weaknesses. The cadets, especially Carver, approach her with a new, profound deference. The mockery was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful respect. They didn't ask her questions about her past. They simply watched her, trying to absorb some of her impossible calm. Then, the real-world crisis hit. It came not as a dramatic klaxon, but as a series of encrypted messages that sent Colonel Madsen into the base's sensitive compartmented information facility, a secure vault known as the SCF. He emerged an hour later, his face pale and grim. He found Alara in Hangar 4, gently wiping dust from the console of Unit 7. "Vance," he said, his voice stripped of all its former arrogance. "We have a situation." He explained it in clipped, precise terms. A biological research outpost, Station Azure, located deep within the contested Asmanov corridor, had gone dark. All communications were severed. Sabotage or an attack was suspected, but sending in a manned team was politically impossible and tactically suicidal. Their only eye in the sky was an RQ-210 Spectre, a next-generation stealth reconnaissance drone currently housed at a nearby staging area. The Spectre was a marvel of technology, capable of near-total invisibility to enemy radar. But its advanced neural interface was still experimental. No pilot at Blackwood was certified, and the lead engineer who understood its esoteric systems was on the other side of the planet. The mission was a guaranteed loss of a $200 million asset. "The interface," Madsen said, watching her face for any reaction. "It requires a direct link system. It's high risk. The neural feedback can be disorienting." He was understating it. In early tests, it had put 2 pilots in comas. Alara finished wiping the console and set the cloth down. She looked up at him, her gaze unwavering. "When do I fly?" It wasn't a question of if. The confidence in her tone was absolute. He led her to the SCF, to a control room she had never been in, a room most of the base didn't know existed. In the center was a single chair, a polished black throne surrounded by monitors, with a sleek, silver helmet resting on a pedestal beside it. This was the real heart of Blackwood Range. Carver and a few other senior officers watched from a glassed-in observation booth, their faces pressed against the soundproof pane. They watched as Alara sat in the chair and lifted the complex helmet. She held it for a moment, her expression unreadable, then lowered it over her head. The visor went dark. On the main screen, a satellite feed showed the Spectre drone, a sharp, angular beast, lifting silently off a remote runway hundreds of miles away. Inside the control room, Alara's vitals were displayed on a small monitor. Her heart rate was slow and steady. Her eyes were closed. She was gone from the room, her consciousness soaring over the desolate mountains of a hostile land. She was home. As the Spectre drone, a silent, unseen predator, slipped across the border into the Asmanov corridor, Colonel Madsen's secure line buzzed with a Priority 1 encryption. He snatched the receiver. Madsen, the voice on the other end, was gravelly, impatient, and carried the unmistakable weight of ultimate authority. It was General Marcus Thorne, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Colonel, I'm looking at a live feed of an unauthorized Spectre flight originating from your sector. I trust you have a damn good explanation. Madsen's blood ran cold. General, we had a critical intelligence blackout at Station Azure. This was a command decision based on time sensitive. Thorne cut him off, his voice like grinding stone. I'm not asking about the mission, Colonel. I'm asking about the pilot. The asset is flying outside of all known performance envelopes. The neural link shows a synchronization rate we've never seen before. Who is in that chair? Madsen hesitated, looking through the glass at the still figure of Alara Vance, a woman whose file claimed she was a logistics sergeant. Sir, the pilot is Master Sergeant Alara Vance. She is highly capable. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The silence was heavier than any reprimand. When Thorne spoke again, his tone had changed completely. The anger was gone, replaced by something that sounded like disbelief or perhaps reverence. Vance? Colonel, confirm her call sign for me. Call sign, sir? Madsen was bewildered. She's a master sergeant. She doesn't have a call sign. Her call sign, Colonel, Thorne repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. Is it Phantom? The word hung in the air of the SCIF. Madsen felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the floor had dropped out from under him. He stared at Alara, at the pale skin of her wrist visible just below her sleeve, where he now knew a skeletal wing was hidden. The redacted file, the impossible skill, the legend of the Ghost program. It all slammed into place with the force of a physical blow. She wasn't a retired NCO assigned to his base. She was a ghost, a legend living in self-imposed exile, hiding in plain sight. Her file wasn't sparse. It was a lie, a carefully constructed fiction to bury one of the nation's most secret and valuable assets. She hadn't been sent to his base to retire. She had been sent there to be forgotten, to be safe, until the day they might need to wake the Phantom again. Yes, sir, Madsen finally managed to say, his own voice sounding distant and thin. Her call sign is Phantom. Thorne let out a slow breath. Then God help whatever's waiting for her at that station. Keep her line open. We're watching. Madsen hung up the phone, his hand trembling slightly. He looked at the woman in the chair, not as a subordinate, but as something else entirely. She was a living weapon, a surgical instrument of unbelievable power that he had assigned to clean old simulators. He felt a profound, gut-wrenching shame. The Spectre drone moved through the enemy's integrated air defense system like a whisper. On the screens in the observation booth, the pilots watched as overlapping rings of simulated radar coverage failed to register its presence. Alara was not just flying below the radar. She was flying between the pulses, exploiting microscopic gaps in the system's refresh rate. She approached Station Azure, a sprawling complex nestled in a deep mountain valley. She didn't fly over it. She descended into the canyon miles away and followed the terrain, using the rock walls to mask her thermal and electronic signature. Her control was so fine, so absolute, that it seemed less like piloting and more like an extension of will. The drone came to a hover outside the main communications array, its optical sensors zooming in. The data began to stream back, high-resolution images, thermal scans, signals intelligence. The station was intact, but there were no signs of life. A sophisticated jamming field was emanating from within, blocking all outgoing transmissions. Alara guided the Spectre to a maintenance hatch, a small port she identified from architectural schematics she had absorbed in seconds. She used the drone's manipulator arm, a tool designed for crude repairs, with the delicacy of a safecracker, bypassing the electronic lock. The hatch slid open. She navigated the drone inside, into the silent, darkened corridors of the station itself. For 15 minutes, the command center held its breath, watching the ghostly images from inside the facility. She mapped the entire interior, located the source of the jamming device, and relayed its specifications. More importantly, she found the station's crew, alive, locked in a secure biocontainment shelter. It had been an automated system failure, not an attack. She retrieved the data, backed the drone out of the station, and began the long, silent journey home. When the Spectre touched down on the remote runway, its mission complete, Ilara pulled the neural helmet off. She blinked slowly, her eyes readjusting to the light of the room. A single bead of sweat traced a path down her temple. She looked tired, but in the way a marathon runner is tired, a deep, cellular exhaustion that spoke of an incredible feat accomplished. She rose from the chair and walked toward the door of the SCF. When she stepped out into the hallway, she stopped. The entire senior command staff of Blackwood Range was there, waiting for her. Colonel Madsen stood at their head. Lieutenant Carver was beside him, his face a mask of awe. No one spoke. The air was thick with unspoken words, with apologies and newfound respect. Then, with emotion so sharp it cracked the silence, Madsen snapped to perfect, rigid attention. He raised his hand in the crispest, most heartfelt salute of his entire career. It wasn't a salute from a superior to a subordinate. It was the salute of a soldier to a legend. One by one, every other officer in the hallway followed his lead. Carver, the brash young pilot, held his salute with a fierce intensity, his eyes locked on Ilara. The sound of a dozen boots clicking together on the polished floor was the only tribute they could offer. Ilara looked at the line of saluting men. She was officially a civilian consultant, a ghost without rank. Saluting back would be a breach of a protocol that, for her, no longer existed. So she simply stood there for a moment, her pale blue eyes meeting Madsen's and then Carver's. She gave a single, slow, deliberate nod. It was not a gesture of forgiveness. It was a gesture of acknowledgement. Then, she walked past them, down the quiet hallway, leaving a trail of shattered assumptions and profound respect in her wake. The next day, a strange and potent energy crackled across Blackwood Range. The base was on its highest state of alert, but not for any external threat. The whispers had solidified into fact, and the story of Master Sergeant Vance, the quiet maintenance woman who was secretly the mythical pilot Phantom, had spread through the barracks and hangars like wildfire. She was no longer just a person. She had become a living piece of folklore. Around noon, the sky itself seemed to hold its breath. A new sound filled the air, a deep, powerful hum that was different from the familiar roar of fighters or the buzz of drones. All eyes turned upward. Descending from the brilliant blue sky was an aircraft that had no business being in this remote corner of Nevada. It was a Boeing 747, but its iconic shape was modified, its livery the unmistakable blue and white of the presidential fleet. It was not the primary Air Force One, but one of its sister aircraft, a flying command post reserved for the highest echelons of government. It landed with an impossible grace for an aircraft its size, taxiing down the main runway and coming to a stop in a designated clear zone that had been hastily cordoned off. The entire base seemed to freeze. Pilots, ground crew, technicians, and administrators stood in silent, stunned disbelief, watching from hangar doors and office windows. Colonel Madsen stood on the tarmac, a silent honor guard of his senior staff behind him. The forward ramp of the massive jet lowered with a hydraulic hiss. A man in a sharp, dark suit emerged, his face impassive, flanked by two Secret Service agents. He did not walk toward Colonel Madsen. He scanned the small crowd that had gathered until his eyes found her. Ilara Vance stood alone, away from the others, her worn duffel bag at her feet. She wore simple, clean fatigues, the rank of Master Sergeant still on her collar, a final, ironic nod to the identity she had worn like a cloak. The man in the suit walked directly to her, his polished shoes crunching softly on the asphalt. He stopped a respectful distance away. "Ma'am," he said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the still desert air. "The president has requested your presence. It's time." He spoke to her not as a soldier, not as a sergeant, but with the profound, unambiguous respect one affords to an equal, or perhaps a superior. Ilara looked at him, then glanced back once at Hangar 4 in the distance. She gave another one of her small, quiet nods. Without a word, she bent down, picked up her bag, and walked toward the ramp. As she ascended into the belly of the aircraft, the man in the suit and his agents fell in behind her. The ramp sealed, the engine spooled up with a powerful whine, and the great jet taxied back to the runway. It took off, climbing steeply into the sky, leaving the entire population of Blackwood Range staring, necks craned, until it was just a disappearing speck. Madsen lowered his gaze from the empty sky and looked at the spot on the tarmac where she had stood. Then he turned and looked at Hangar 4. He could almost feel the quiet hum of Unit 7, the forgotten relic that she had transformed into an instrument of impossible skill. He finally understood. She wasn't just a pilot, not even just a legend. She was a strategic asset, a weapon of last resort, a ghost they kept hidden in the attic until the world itself was in peril. The dust stirred by the jet's powerful engines began to settle back onto the tarmac, leaving only the profound silence of the desert and the indelible, unspoken truth of the woman they had called Phantom. Her strength had not needed words. Her actions had spoken for her, and now, her departure was the final, resounding statement.